Hi, my name is Paul. I'm doing a commentary series on Jordan Peterson's biblical series, and this is the first of a three-part little sub-series of it, all on chaos. Chaos is such an integral piece of Jordan Peterson's vision. I think it's an integral piece of why he sees the Bible as relevant, why he finds the Bible compelling, and it's integral in terms of his entire maps of meaning structure. Now, this first piece, I'm going to get into some of my own story because I'm going to get into the question of how as a pastor Jordan Peterson changed how I read the Bible. Now, some of you who are atheists or agnostics who are Jordan Peterson fans probably have to defend yourself against your atheist and agnostic friends who like Sam Harris or some of the other prominent atheists right now, because they're a little worried about the state of your agnostic consciousness for listening to Jordan Peterson and going to lectures about the Bible and maybe even contemplating getting involved in a church or listening to a video by a pastor. I have similar problems. There are friends of mine that are worried about. They're not worried about the state of my conscious atheist heart. They're worried about the state of my believer's soul, because Jordan Peterson does not have credentials as a Christian. He's not a church leader. His answers about whether or not he's a Christian are sufficiently complicated that they cause many Christian conservatives to worry. His stance on Darwin and evolution and science causes many Christian conservatives to worry. And so some of his other ideas, his affinity to Jung, his going into other ancient mythologies, the way he answers some of his questions, these things cause Christians anxiety. And I talked about that in the video that I did on The Office. And so in this video, before I delve deep, and I'm going to go deep into this issue of chaos because it's a really big deal and it's been integral, as you'll see in this video, for me. Before I go deep into this, I need to do a little bit of biography, and whereas maybe some of you atheists are looking over your shoulder to the left, in this video I'm going to be looking over my shoulder to the right, because I already have friends who are asking questions to me. Why are you doing this? How can you do this? There are commenters that say, how can you as a Christian minister promote Jordan Peterson? I don't know that I'm promoting him as much as I'm in dialogue with him. And as hopefully I develop this series, you'll see some of the places that I agree with him, that I appreciate him, that he's helped me. That's in fact the point of this video, to explain some of the ways he's really helped me, especially with respect to this idea of chaos. But then in the third of this series, I'm going to get into some of the critique that I have and some of the points that I think he missed. So let's begin. A little bit of biography about myself. As I mentioned before, I'm a third generation minister in the Christian Reformed Church in North America. I grew up in a small, multi-racial, mostly African American church, and this was a church that my father planted. And I, like some of you who have written in the comment section, grew up wearing bathrobes for Christmas pageants and well-meaning but slightly eccentric Sunday school teachers and lots of really crazy things. And so in many ways, because because my father's church was very much in an African American community during the Great Migration up from the American South, we lived just outside of New York City. This was my growing up, and so this was what was normal to me. And so I grew up with the Bible. I grew up memorizing the Bible. I grew up singing Sunday school songs. I grew up learning all of these stories in the Bible. And so I've known the Bible since I have any memory at all. Now, when I went to seminary, I went to the same seminary. This is my grandfather and my father. Both have passed away. My grandfather went to Calvin Seminary in the 20s. My father went to Calvin Seminary in the 50s, and I went to Calvin Seminary in the 80s. And all of us had to learn some Greek and Hebrew. They had dropped the Latin and Dutch requirements by the time I went through. Part of me is a little disappointed they did, because I really wish I knew Latin and Dutch. But we did have to study Greek and Hebrew and systematic theology and a whole bunch of theology. Now, one of the things that you learn when you go to seminary is that you begin to read the Bible at different resolutions. For example, this is I will be commenting on Jordan Peterson's treatment of Genesis 1, and this is going to take me a while because Genesis 1 is a pretty important passage. But many of us begin reading the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovering over the waters. Now there's a lot of mysterious stuff that doesn't even get covered over in contemporary translations. The top one is translation from the NIV 2011. Now the one just below it to the for you, I'm dyslexic, so I never know right and left. But the one just below it is from Tanakh. Now, Tanakh is a translation of the Bible for the Jewish community. And so part of the complaint that a lot of Jewish scholars and even Jewish lay people have against Christian translations of the Bible is that Christians translate back into the Old Testament things from their New Testament. Now, for Christians, there are theological reasons why they do that, and I think I'll probably get into that in some subsequent videos. But obviously, Jewish communities and Jewish scholars find that habit annoying, and so they have contemporary and modern translations of the Bible themselves. And if you read, for example, their translation of Genesis 1, verses 1 and 2, it goes like this. When God began to create the heavens and the earth. Now that gets into a lot, which I'm not going to get into in terms of the, is verse 1 a preface? Is verse 1 the beginning of the story? Did God create ex nihilo? That's Latin for basically from nothing. Or, as I think the Genesis 1 text talks about, in this particular text, that God begins with this tohu wavohu. God begins with this formless and void. Now, in subsequent videos, I'm going to get into John Walton and get into these things in more detail, but this is where it begins. So the Tanakh, again, the Jewish translation of the Bible, when God began to create the heaven and the earth being unformed and void, with darkness over the surface of the deep, and a wind from God sweeping over the water. Now again, notice Spirit of God in the NIV, which is in capital letters, very Christian. The Jews obviously don't have a doctrine of the Trinity, and so they just have ruach in the Hebrew as wind. So, and down below is the contemporary Masoretic text, which is the foundation for most of the translation for the Old Testament. And so, if you want to look at how the Old Testament is put together, often if you had at least some seminary training or maybe a little bit of training in how to use contemporary software like Logos, you get used to playing around with the Hebrew text, and now with computer software like Logos, which is what I took this out of, which is the software I use when I do my job, you can do a great deal of work on individual words, and we're going to get into some of that a little bit later in the video. I want to go through a little bit of history of theology for those of you who are unfamiliar with theology. I know a number of commenters commented that you've never been to church or you're not familiar with church, and so obviously for those of you not, and even for many Christian lay people who aren't familiar with the formal discipline of theology, theology has a history just like all of our other disciplines. And what I wanted to distinguish between was biblical theology and systematic theology. Now biblical theology basically answers the question, what does the Bible say? And it focuses on the theology of the Bible as such, and attempts in many ways to try to summarize the message of the Bible. Biblical theology really roared into being in the 20th century and is pretty strong right now. Systematic theology, in some more conservative groups, especially some conservative Reformed groups, systematic theology continues to be to be worked and focused upon, but nothing like it was in the 19th and 20th century. Systematic theology approaches the Bible in a different way. The systematic theology, in a sense, brings to the Bible our question and attempts to address it in a formal way. And so systematic theology have the Bible answer the questions we bring to it. And systematic theology was often constructed around what were called the loci, or basically the points. It's kind of the logic of theology. Prolegomena, I talked about that in the first videos. Doctrine of God, or theology proper. Anthropology, which is the doctrine of humanity, getting into who we are and what we are. And I think, as I mentioned, part of what attracted me to Jordan Peterson in these videos, when his description of human beings as chimps filled with snakes, I thought that was rather Augustinian and Calvinist in terms of his viewpoint of that. Christology, which is the study of Christ. Soteriology, which is the study of salvation. Ecclesiology, which is the study of the church. And eschatology, which is the study of the last things. And so in the 19th and 20th century, systematic theology really had its heyday, and this man named Louis Berkhof was probably the most famous, maybe Gerhardus Voss will give him a run for his money, but Louis Berkhof, probably the most famous theologian of the middle of the century of the Christian Reformed Church, wrote a significant volume and some smaller volumes for use in the church. He was both a scholar and a churchman, and very much kind of systematized theology, and this dominated the Christian Reformed Church as it dominated many other conservative denominations in the middle of the 20th century. But while all that was going on during the 19th century, there were a lot of movements in terms of the Old Testament. One of the things I picked up in Peterson's biblical series was the Wellhausen thesis, the documentary hypothesis, and Peterson talked a little bit about J and P and E. This gets into the hypothesis that the Old Testament was a compilation of texts, which I think it's quite clear that the Old Testament is. I also think that became a very big deal in the 19th century, and a lot of work got into form criticism, source criticism, trying to kind of get behind the text at what was behind the text. And that kind of gets into, again, as I talked about in previous videos, the quest after the Protestant Reformation, after the Enlightenment, to root truth in our view of history. And so the contemporary, or the 19th century project was we need to know the history of the Bible, and so we take it apart. It also tried to answer the question of why, if you read the Hebrew Scriptures, or as Christians call it, the Old Testament, why there's so much repetition, why the language is funny, why sometimes it's stilted. And so part of the answer for that was, well, it's stilted because it's kind of a hodgepodge of all these documents being put together, and so that's why the Bible is in the form that it's in. Now we're going to address this in a minute, so hold on. Well, in the 20th century, after working this hypothesis and this way of approaching the Scripture for a long time, scholars and biblical studies and biblical theology, really came out and said, this is okay, so we can talk about J and P and E, and we can fight which text belongs to which, and we can speculate about the background of the story. But what's really important is the story, that not the forms of the text before we received what we have, but how the story itself is and how the text is put together. And a scholar named Brevard Childs came onto the scene and really pushed introduction to the Old Testament as Scripture, and began saying, we ought not to spend all of our time in commentaries and as scholars arguing about the sources and the forms of Scripture. We should read the Bible how it is and work at it from there. Now also along in the late 20th century came an amazing Jewish scholar. I believe he teaches at Berkeley, just down the road from me. Well, little ways down the road. I'm in Sacramento. He's in San Francisco. But, Robert Alter. And I remember, so to back up, this was the stuff that we cut our eye eye teeth on at seminary, systematic theology, but you could already tell it was in some ways fading, although we had just a terrific theologian and Christian, Neil Plantinga, the brother of Al Plantinga, was my professor of systematics at Calvin Seminary, and his lectures were just amazing and thrilling. But I really enjoyed, when I was in seminary, study of the Bible. And so then I found Childs to be, enlightening and, such a relief in terms of, okay, let's look at the stories, these stories that I learned as a child. Let's read let's read the canon as scripture and go from there. And then when, in my Old Testament studies classes, we started to read Robert Alter, that was just thrilling. Because Alter comes along and says, all of this repetition and playing with names, and this is not the seams of hurried, clumsy scribes patching text together. This is actually literary structure of an ancient culture. And if you want to understand what the text is saying, you have to read it within the culture, and you have to read it within the literary paradigm of the culture. And Robert Alter suddenly made the Bible come alive and talked about the art of biblical narrative. This is a small book, and it's a very accessible book. And so if you're interested in trying to figure out how the Old Testament communicates, why you have these type scenes that get repeated, for example, why in the book of Genesis everyone meets their wife at a well, and why it's important to pay attention to what the first words a character says when he's being introduced. All of this is literary stuff. And what Robert Alter, again, a Jewish scholar, not a Christian, but a Jewish scholar, makes the point. He says, all of this is intentional, and all of this is in fact not a hodgepodge, but all of this is amazing literature. And this in fact gets picked up by a guy like Eric Auerbach in his magnificent book Mimesis. And one of my Old Testament classes, we read some of the first chapter on Odysseus's scar from Mimesis, and I remember reading that in seminary, and just lights went on, because here he was contrasting Homer with the Bible, and he was recognizing the subtlety and the nuance and the understatement and the economy of the biblical text, and contrasting Yahweh with Zeus. And so if you're looking for something, if you enjoyed Jordan Peterson's biblical studies, read, go to the library. It's a big, I got my copy around here somewhere. It's a big fat book, but read the first chapter, and you will get a sense for the artistry of the literature of the Bible. And for me, that's what really helped me fall in love with studying the Bible and reading the Bible, not just in a religious sense, but also in an artistic sense, and to appreciate the literary quality of the book. And if you want to read a small book, one of the earliest books we read when we learned Hebrew we read the book of Jonah, which is a nice short 4 chapters, and the vocabulary in Hebrew is not that expansive, but reading a whole book of the Bible in Hebrew for the first time was just like going from a black and white TV to a color TV. And now I know almost all of you, and my Hebrew is very rusty, but almost all of you will never have the chance to learn Hebrew. Some of you who are from Jewish backgrounds, I'm sure, learned it right away. But there's if you're going to seriously study the Bible and you're young, do the hard work of learning the original languages, because it will pay off later on. And Peterson mentions that in his quote when he says, too bad for me, I don't know Hebrew. And so the rest of us have to work from other sources. And so again, in this little 3-part series, I'm going to bring in Dr. John Walton, not physically, because again, I'm not, if Paul Vanderklay calls, nobody's going to return my call. So, I don't get a chance to have Jordan Peterson here and John Walton there. I would love to have, it's funny listening to everyone talk about who they want to hear Jordan Peterson talk to. And I've got my list. I'd like to hear Jordan Peterson talk to Tim Keller. I'd like to hear Jordan Peterson talk to John Walton. Jordan Peterson and John Walton would have an amazing conversation. I'd like to have Jordan Peterson talk to C.S. Lewis. But C.S. Lewis has passed, so that isn't going to happen. So again, part of what I want to do with these videos is, in a virtual way, I'm going to bring in the work of, in this little 3-part series, the work of John Walton in, and have him converse with some of the stuff that Jordan Peterson has done in his lectures. So then, we'll fast forward to the blogosphere and the internet. And one of the most popular blogs on the internet for I'd say moderate Christians. Part of the difficulty for non-Christians is understanding this tremendously diverse ecosystem that Christians are a part of. There's the Orthodox, there's the Roman Catholics, and just amongst American Protestants, you've got all kinds of flavors and variations. You've got the mainline, you've got the fundamentalists, you've got the evangelicals, you've got the Reformed. Well, Scott McKnight, who's part of at least one of the branches of the emergent movement, New Testament scholar, somewhere in, I don't know, North Park Seminary, someplace, I don't know where he is. But anyway, he writes he writes a number of good books. Jesus Creed is one of the most popular blogs, and he has a scientist that he often has on his blog, and I don't know her name. I think she tries to stay rather anonymous because, again, when you start crossing these lines, if you're a scientist and you're studying the Bible, other scientists are going to look at you and say, I don't know if you're so hot. If you're a Christian and you're studying science, some Christians are going to say, I don't know if you're so hot. So this scientist, Scott McKnight, often has on his blog and writes some wonderful stuff about hard science and questions of origin, and she's obviously both a professional scientist and a very articulate, well-read lay Christian, and she's always working these angles. And for me, I find that very helpful. Biologos was founded Francis Collins. Now I can't remember the title of his book. But I have his book, and I've read at least some of his book. Francis Collins worked on the Human Genome Project and then became a Christian, and he writes about it in his book. He and actually some people from Calvin College, my alma mater, and some other good people too, established Biologos. That's biologos.org, that works on trying to figure out this connection between the Bible and science and Christianity and how this all fits together. And that is a very controversial enterprise for a lot of Christians, because of course there are other Christians that say, no, this is not only in error, this is a betrayal of your service to your God. And so this is all hot button stuff. Well, so I've always been interested in these kinds of issues, and eventually I bumped into a scholar named John Walton. And John Walton, this is the Wikipedia thing, born in 1952, professor of Old Testament at Wheaton College. Now, Wheaton and Moody, pretty solid conservative evangelical credentials. Moody, you're really barking over there into fundamentalist land, I think, a little bit. I don't know. I got to watch those throwaway phrases. Maybe that's a bias. I don't know a lot about Moody Bible Institute. I know they're conservative Christians. His primary focus is in areas of comparison between the Old Testament and the ancient Near East, particularly Genesis. And he's written a number of very interesting books. And actually, again, because this is YouTube, if you're interested in John Walton, go out and just search for John Walton on YouTube, and you'll find lots of things from him where he's trying to figure out, again, what this Old Testament text is. And so in the second of this 3-part series, I'm going to have quite a bit more from John Walton, and I'm going to engage some of Peterson's stuff from Biblical Series 2 in with some of the things from John Walton. But if you're interested in him, also the top one there is from the Veritas Forum. And for many of you who are who are not Christians, who are atheists and agnostics, you might be very interested in some of these Veritas Forum videos, because these are lectures given on university campuses, and they'll often have a skeptical or a skeptic or a non-believer, and let's say a Christian, could be a philosopher, could be a scientist, could be a theologian, and they will just have a very calm, reasonable, thoughtful, intellectual conversation about issues of faith and contemporary life. Well, John Walton is on one of these where he sits down with an Old Testament scholar who is more liberal than he is, and they're going to talk about the kinds of issues that are at hand. So one of the things, so I was, again, I'm going all through my history here and all through my story here. And one of the things as a kid that always bothered me was the question, why does God let the serpent in the garden? There's all these questions which naturally arise when, I don't want to jump too far into Genesis 2 and 3, but there's all these questions that arise when you read Genesis 2 and 3. Why does God let a tree in the garden? And as a child, I would often reflect. Now, again, I grew up in church. I grew up in a Christian Reformed church. This is the Reformed community. I would always wrestle with the question, why did God let people fall? Because, again, my vision of life pre-lapsarian, there's a theologically technical term, pre-lapsarian life was there was no death and everything was wonderful. And, well, the naked part, as a kid, that sounds a little embarrassing, but okay. Why on earth did God let evil into the world? And I think the text is written in a way that we would, in fact, ask these questions. Now, one of the things that I caught as I was going through John Walton's Lost World of Genesis 1, Lost World of Adam and Eve, John Walton shows up on the Phil Vischer podcast, which I usually keep up with. And that's all also kind of evangelical camp. Phil Vischer, the creator of VeggieTales, Skye Jitani, who I think is a wonderful Christian writer and pastor / theologian / speaker. John Walton makes the comment that the serpent is a chaos creature, and I remember hearing that and thinking, now wait a minute. I grew up always thinking about good and evil. Again, this is this low resolution dualism that I think is a function of consciousness, which I spoke about in previous videos. There's good and evil, there's right and wrong, there's good and bad. And when John Walton starts talking about chaos, right away that almost introduces a third category. So here, like in my office video, we've kind of got a triangle. We've got good, evil, and chaos. And so then the question, well, is chaos really evil? Well, it gets into questions, something like natural disasters. When there's a natural disaster, like the tsunami that came through a number of years ago and hundreds of thousands of people died, and the theological question immediately rises up. Where was God when the tsunami hit? So you have good, evil, and chaos. Let's say if you were living in an area that still had wild beasts. I love to camp in Yosemite. Let's say I'm camping in Yosemite, or let's say I go up to Montana where there's real bears. Let's say I'm camping in Yellowstone where there's grizzlies, and I'm incautious with my food, and in the middle of the night a grizzly comes in and, hurts me or hurts my family. Well, is the grizzly evil? Or is there another category? There's good, there's evil, and there's chaos. And how are we to regard chaos? And kind of in this triangle, chaos is kind of a switch hitter. Sometimes you look at the power of a grizzly bear and you say, wow, there's glory there. And at some point when I get into more theology later on, we're going to have to talk a lot about glory. But there's a grizzly bear is chaotic. It's powerful. It's glorious in that you can't help but be in awe of it. Yet, if a grizzly bear mauls my family or even just, tears open my car, I'm going to describe that bear as evil. And that wouldn't be out of place. And so, when John Walton began to, talk about chaos, and Walton didn't emphasize this much. And in fact, I got nearly zero of this idea of chaos when, again, I learned in seminary, there's tohu wavohu at the beginning in Genesis 1, and it's chaotic, but they just left it there. And so chaos as a category in terms of my own biblical theology or my practical theology. Now, practical theology is the theology that I use as a pastor in pastoral care and engaging people with their questions. Chaos wasn't really functional. And so, well, I'm a Protestant. Now, what does that mean? Well, so there's the Orthodox. So the church was one huge community, and then the great schism that happens in the 11th century AD between the Western Latin Church and the Eastern Greek Church. I'm not going to go into that whole history, but that's really the difference between the Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church. And of course, in the West, the Latin Church continues to go, and then the Protestant Reformation, the church just kind of splays. And one of the issues in the Protestant Reformation was, and I talked about this a little bit in previous videos, this idea of the Scripture or the Bible is our foundation of authority. And so as a Protestant, as I listen to John Walton and I hear about chaos and it's kind of shaking up my systematic theology, well, what do I need to do? Well, as a Protestant, as a minister in the Christian Reformed Church, which I have in fact taken vows to theological allegiance to my denomination, part of those vows are that my theological matrix is always subject to the Bible. So, along comes chaos, and chaos brings chaos into my theological world. And so what do I do with it? I have to go to the Bible. And I have to look at the Bible and study the Bible and ask the question, well, where is chaos in the Bible? And how does this work in my world? Now, so I'm processing all of this, and chaos really isn't a big deal. Every now and then I come to it and I think about it, and it kind of seeps into some lessons and categories. And then, of course, I come across Jordan Peterson. And I'm taking his maps, I'm going through his maps of meaning videos, and chaos is right there in the beginning. And chaos is this foundational, instrumental piece of his entire matrix. And suddenly lights start to come on. And I start to say, okay, I not only am now more motivated to delve deeper into Scripture on the subject of chaos, but Jordan Peterson has helped me see chaos in a whole new light. For example, one of the points he makes in Maps of Meaning is that when you get boy, this is old PC world. When you get something in the mail, is it a piece of paper or is it an envelope, let's say from the IRS or from long lost family member or from your ex-wife or from something? This is not a piece. This is chaos. This is a world and it can be a word or a letter or a statement or a look. And suddenly chaos comes in. And so, well, I think all of us have our stories about when we started watching Jordan Peterson and a light came on or chaos came flooding in or something in our world moved. And so it's like, I'm going to have to look a lot more at this chaos business. So one of the I don't know, I'm thinking about maybe having two versions of this video, one where I include the talk, one where I don't. It comes in at 1 hour, 1 minute, 11 seconds of the Joe Rogan Experience show with Peterson and Weinstein. And there's just a tremendous, from that point on for a fairly long time, there's a really good conversation about Weinstein's idea of metaphorical truth versus what Weinstein says is the top level, I'm going to say physical truth, because let's say it's governed by physics. And I spoke in the last one that I think that's wrong, because as human beings, our apprehension of physical truth must always be nested within story, the story realm, the story world. And so if, this part of the video, Peterson says there's this pattern, and then he gets right into chaos. And he says this pattern of chaos is all over the place. And, actually, once I saw that and once I began thinking about it, I saw very much where, there is a lot of use pastorally for this. Now, I'm going to pause here for a second, so just in case I decide to interject a video, I can. I'm just going to mute the mic, and that's going to signal my computer and leave a message so I know where to put this. Okay, pause is over. And so I began to understand the pastoral value of understanding chaos. And one of the ideas I've had for a long time about theology and about Christianity is that it's got to be scalable. And actually, I found this in C.S. Lewis too. And I've got way more projects. And the further I go in this, the more projects I can imagine. But here's the thing. Jesus stands, again, I used this before. Jesus stands at the end of the Gospel of Matthew. He stands on a mountaintop. See, this is an example of how Jordan Peterson has affected me. When I see Jesus on a mountaintop in the Bible, I am always thinking of archetypes. Why is on a mountain? What does a mountain mean? And I don't mean, the mountain is a great hill of dirt. C.S. Lewis's comment. Some people say a star is a flaming ball of gas. Well, that's not just what a star is. A star is so much more. So in the Bible, so often, and I knew this somewhat beforehand, you'd find Jesus on a mountain, you say, oh, okay, that connects with Moses and Sinai and so on and so forth. But what Peterson did was connect, okay, mountains with archetypes. Well, what is a mountain? And as we get further into Genesis 1, I'm going to draw the Genesis 1 representation that I use in some of my videos and in some of my teaching, where somebody asked me about astrology, and we're going to have to talk about that in terms of why in the ancient world astrology was so understood. What does that say about its culture? So Jesus is on a mountaintop, and he says to his disciples, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. And again, as I said last time, this is something I use often. People say to me, well, I don't know about the virgin birth. And I'd say, well, okay. Well, think about a guy standing on a mountaintop and saying something like that. Suddenly you're in the throes of C.S. Lewis's trilemma. Or maybe they lied about him. Maybe Jesus never said such a thing. Maybe we can construct a historical Jesus where he would not say such a thing, because in our cultural position, it would be terrible for someone to say such a thing. I would never say such a thing. Jordan Peterson would never say such a thing. Most sane, credible, normal people would never say such a thing. Jesus says such a thing. All authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Have these amazing visions. He calls himself the Son of Man. And if you read Daniel 7, the Son of Man, that is this enormous figure in Daniel 7 who is given an eternal kingdom. And this is the code word that Jesus uses of himself. Well, what does that mean? Well, then there's lots of layers to it. Well, so Jesus has to be a savior big enough to save the cosmos from decay and rebellion. And he's got to be a savior who scales small enough, and I actually talked about this in my Sunday sermon last week, that when Zechariah gets the message, he interprets the salvation of God within his own frame of reference. And when Mary gets the message from the angel, she interprets the message from the angel within her own frame of reference. And so that when, for example, if a homeless man is sleeping outside my door, when he thinks about Jesus, he's thinking about praying for his daily bread. He's thinking about praying that he not be beat up at night, or he's, some of the friends I have who sleep on the street, they're praying for finding pot and beer and whatever. And you might think, well, you shouldn't pray for that, but they do. And yeah. And so Jesus has to be scalable. He has to save me from my enemies, and he has to save me from myself. And he's got to save me from principalities and powers. And if we ever get all the way into, somebody asked a question about Paul, which I would really love to get to, and maybe I will sometime. But principalities and powers, which if you're on the supernaturalist side of thing, you can think of Peretti's This Present Darkness and angels and demons all around. And, Pentecostal Christians like to imagine the world like that. Now, if you're a secularist, and really there's no middle, even if you're a theist, or maybe you're an ardent secularist living within the iron box of empiricism, principalities and powers can be governments and cultures and histories that limit us and mold us and shape us. It can be sociology of knowledge. So Jesus needs to save us from all of these things, and he needs to save us from things in our past, things in our present, and things in our future. And again, this ties into Jordan Peterson's Maps of Meaning course, where he's talking about the constraint of kind of the critique of postmodernism he gives, that says, not anything can be interpreted in any way. Things in my life have to work for my past. They have to work for my present. They have to work for various situations. They have to work for my future. And so if Jesus is any kind of savior, he's got to address all those levels. And so then this language of chaos, as a pastor, well, you'll pick it up in the sermon I preached 2 Sundays ago, when, I used exactly this language in terms of, your spouse says to you, I want a divorce. Or the police show up at your door and say, there's been a car accident. Or the doctor sits down and says, you have cancer. Or your boss comes to work and says, pack up your office. Or collect your tools. Well, in this moment, chaos comes in. And now suddenly we've got Logos and light and Genesis 1. And so as a pastor, the journey I was on, which I walked through here, following John Walton, Jordan Peterson comes in, and I'd already been, reading more Gilgamesh and reading more ancient mythology and doing all of this. Then suddenly Jordan Peterson comes in, and lights just start going on. And I begin to say, oh, well, isn't this interesting? Well, how is this going to change how I read the Bible? I can't read this. I can't read mountains again. I can't understand darkness again. I can't understand what happens at Jesus' crucifixion when the sun is darkened and the earth quakes. Well, what are all those things? Those are all archetypal chaos motifs, and they're through the Bible. And I knew that before, but now I know it more, and I'm going to get to this, I know it with a new edge. Now, in Reformed theology, some people ask me, well, what does Reformed mean? Well, the Reformed is a branch of the Protestant Reformation that follows John Calvin to a degree, kind of his inheritance. And John Calvin was a second-generation reformer. Luther was a first-generation reformer. John Calvin was by training a lawyer. He was a Frenchman, and he was living in Geneva with a whole bunch of other French refugees in Geneva. And John Calvin tried to organize the city. And Google John Calvin. He's a hot topic. Still is, even after all these years. But John Calvin makes the point in his Institutes that God speaks to us in a sense as we speak to children. And this is called divine accommodation. And what this means is that, and I think Peterson is dead on right here, that and having been a missionary, having in a sense been a third culture person, because as I mentioned, I grew up in an African American community, but also in a Dutch CRC community. And then I went overseas and worked with Haitians in the Dominican Republic. So working cultural matrices has always been a part of my life. And so I understand the fact that if God wanted to enter into this story, he needed to do so in a way that engaged and inhabited culture. And so God comes into the story, and if he's going to deal with, according to Christians, he came in and called Abraham and developed Israel. That's how the whole story goes. And now again, I know a lot of you say, and it's a big discussion, is that literal history? Is that mythological? Is that figurative? We'll see what we do with this word literal at some point. We're going to talk about it a little bit when we talk about John Walton. But John Calvin basically says what the scriptures do is they put lenses on us. Now a lot of non-religious people are going to say, yeah, that's the problem. You've got those lenses on. You've got to take them off. Well, And this is part of the point of what postmodernity gets right, and I think Peterson agrees with this. I've listened to him carefully on this topic, that we all do see the world through our filters. There is no view of the world without filters, and actually I was taught this as a young man in Christian school. I went to a conservative Christian Reformed church, is known for doing their Christian schools, and I was taught this, that we all have presuppositions. We all have assumptions we bring to the world. In Jordan Peterson talking about Immanuel Kant, we already have a framework through which we take in all of this information. And so Calvin, in a sense, says, well, if you're going to have filters, if you're going to have lenses, why don't you try these on and see how the world looks? And in many ways, C.S. Lewis makes a very similar statement about that when he talks about when C.S. Lewis talks about how, Christianity, is in a sense the light that helps me see the rest of the world. And C.S. Lewis was a pretty determined Platonist in some ways. And so, you can see some of that drifting through there. So divine accommodation and John Calvin. And then the second point, which again, Peterson really helped me with, is that there must be a common language between the ancient world cultures and rooted more deeply within us. And that's where Peterson and his ideas of evolution and his ideas of circuitry doing two different things, and some of the stuff he gets through Jung, that somehow Christianity, or not Christianity, but somehow these motifs are deeper. And again, when we get into Walton, because Walton is working this same area, these motifs are deeper, and this began to help explain some things for me. For example, Peterson makes the point, and I think he's dead on right. You can have a relationship with a pet dog a lot better than you can have with a pet lizard, and a lot better than you can have with ants. Why? Well, there's dogs can almost read our minds in some ways. So they kind of look like that, and I have a dog, and I love dogs, but dogs, there's a reason we get along with dogs. And then one of the questions I've always had is, why do so many ancient peoples get the Bible so well? And if you read a lot of, say, 19th century history of missions, it's often the case that missionaries come into a place, and there's the Poisonwood Bible, and sometimes they make a huge mess of things, but sometimes they come into a place, and usually, like in China, once the missionaries get kicked out and they stop mucking it up, they kind of leave the Bible, maybe even a translation of the Bible, like Wycliffe does, in the hands of a people, and they start frogging around with the Bible. And, according to maybe some in the church in the West, they do some crazy and wrong and heretical and immoral things with the Bible, but they start mucking around with it, and they start appropriating it, and it starts coming to life for them. And so I wondered, why is this book so transcultural? And so when I listen to Peterson, he doesn't necessarily give me an answer or the answer for that, but he begins to give me interesting ideas of why perhaps the Bible is so transcultural. Now, as I mentioned before, I was a missionary in the Dominican Republic, and so all of these issues of culture. One of the books I read early on in my time in the Dominican Republic was a missionary classic called Missionary Methods, St. Paul's or Ours. And there's another companion book by a early 20th century missionary named Roland Allen. And he has all these stories about he was a missionary who was set out to try and help this national church, and he very quickly learned that there were what has sometimes been called rice Christians, that there's these kinds of Christians that basically were hanging on to the mission because they could get status or money or other goodies from it. And Roland Allen pretty quickly figured out that there was no point in that. These people didn't really have a lot of interest in what Roland Allen was interested in. They were just kind of interested in getting a connection to North America or getting money or something like that. And then there's all these stories about missionaries who couldn't make the rounds because there's all kinds of chaos, especially in the 19th century, couldn't make the rounds. And so, wasn't able to get out to some of these far-reaching communities, and then to begin to discover that the communities the missionary spent less time in became more Christian and grew better. And now looking at, at it from the perspective of the early 21st century, the answer was quite obvious, that the missionary wasn't mucking up the people he was trying to engage with his own culture. That the missionary's own culture became a tremendous stumbling block. And so, for example, I met a missionary in kind of this missionary boot camp that I was in, and he was teaching in the boot camp, and he basically was one of more of these Wycliffe style missions where he would translate the Bible and learn the language and give the Bible to the people and say, "Here you go, have at it." And people would look at it, and they would do some stuff that looked pretty crazy to us, but it was this process of cultural appropriation that always made me ask the question, why do ancient peoples get the Bible? Well, maybe there's this ancient, and at least according to Peterson, evolutionary, genetic, epigenetic perhaps too, commonality within us that, well, why do all of us, when we go up on top of a mountain, say, why do people from diverse places of the world go to Yosemite National Park? Again, I don't live too far from Yosemite. It's about 3.5 hours away. But when I go there, it's full of tourists from Germany, from China, from Japan, from all over the world. They all go to Yosemite National Park. Something is happening when you walk in that park and you see, this gets into this other, you see the glory of the park. Well, why should a big hole in the ground carved by glaciers give us a sense of glory? Well, there's a psychological element to that. Why do mountains mean what they mean in so many places? Why is sacrifice so ubiquitous around the world? Why is marriage such a universal institution through human history? And you look at all of these histories. Now, a few months ago, I finished reading Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel. Fascinating book. And again, I'm reading 1493 now. I'm working my way through that if I can, cut loose some more time to read. But what's with all of these connections? And again, this is what Peterson helps me with. And so this is part of the reason that I'm interested, because again, this great Jungian cloud of witnesses that composes me, not just the conscious piece of me up front here in my face. It's saying, there's something to this. There's something to this, and there had to be, because there was a common culture in which there were a family of cultures where the Israelites and the Philistines and the Moabites and the Amorites and the Egyptians and the Babylonians and the Assyrians and the Hittites, there was a common family of cultures that was going through all of this, and there's something we can learn from that. And I wanted to give you a little example. Genesis 1:21. And I'm gonna have to listen again to Peterson's second biblical series to see if he picks up on this. But it's very interesting. In verse 21 of Genesis 1, I'll begin in verse 20. And God said, "Let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures." Now notice, let the waters bring forth. And John Walton deals with this in his book, The Lost World of Genesis 1. Bara, create, is used at certain times, and then other verbs are used at other times, and John Walton makes a big deal of what this verb means. John Walton thinks this is functional creation, and again, I'll get into that more in the next video. But so verse 20 says, "Let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the dome of the sky." Okay. So God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves. Now, the word create hasn't been used for quite a few verses, and here it's dropped in here, and it's dropped in with what in English is translated here, this is the New Revised Standard Version, as sea monsters. And I remember as a kid, I hadn't noticed this in this verse. Why suddenly does the word create pop up again in Genesis 1? And why is it associated with the sea monsters? Well, these sea monsters are chaos creatures. We are working this theme of chaos again, and so the Tannin here in the Hebrew, these are the sea monsters. Well, who are the sea monsters? Well, so here's what you do here's what you do if you're interested in the Bible. So you start digging around in it, and you start looking at, well, where is this word used? Tanin. Brown Driver Briggs, the 19th century dictionary, lexicon of the Hebrew language that you can look up online because it's been in public domain forever. They translate, Hanin as serpent, dragon, or sea monster. Oh, so wait a minute. You can translate verse 21, the great God creates the dragon? Oh, so some of you who know theology, a lot of bells are going off. And some of those bells are anxiety because, if you looked at this, I probably, in a little way, threw you into a little bit of chaos. What's going on in that verse? Why did we go back to this word create? Why are we pointing to, the sea monsters, serpents, dragons? So then if you look at, say, how this word is translated in the NIV, that's what that little chart is. You see serpents, snake, creatures, sea monsters, great sea creatures, monsters. What is the Bible talking about? Now, one of the things that you'll figure out is that, the Bible, just like the English language, you have snake and serpent. The Bible will use two different words for a thing that we have as the same. And that's when you get into this idea in biblical studies of a semantic range. And then you pay attention, which word gets chosen for which context? And this is where we're going to get back into Robert Alter, The Art of Biblical Narrative, and also historical, literary working of the Bible. And then, so then you do a little bit more research, and you find that in Isaiah 13, this word is used as a subject, and it gets translated as jackals. And you say, now, wait a minute. You said serpent, dragon, sea monster. Those I can keep together. But jackal? Jackal's a little dog-like creature. Well, and jackals inhabit the wilderness. Oh. Now, light should be going on. The sea, the great primordial sea in Genesis 1, out of which God speaks order from chaos. Well, that's water. Well, in the Old Testament, wilderness is also chaos. Now, this is going to be tremendously important when we get to Exodus. And actually, I'll be dealing with this in the third of these series, where I play out this theme with respect to temple. Because, and I'll tip my hand here a little bit, one of the things that Jordan Peterson makes no mention of in Genesis 1, quite reasonably so, almost everybody misses it in Genesis 1. I never saw it until John Walton, that Genesis 1 is a temple text. And you say, what do you mean it's a temple text? There's no temple in Genesis 1 in the early part of Genesis 2. And there's no altar in Genesis 2 and 3, and we're going to have to talk about that too. So jackals and sea monsters are coming from the same root word in Hebrew. Why? Well, and then lights went on. Because again, of course, I read Metaphysical Club because Jordan Peterson mentioned it in one of his videos. And that's where I got this nice tidbit about, what really the origin of the species was in that context. And then this great paragraph, Darwin regretted the word selection, suggested an intention. Because Darwin was really focused on, a naturalistic explanation of the differentiation of the species that doesn't have intentionality or a divine plan behind it. But now read the rest of this paragraph because it's critical. Natural selection is a blind process. Always remember, blind is a metaphor. Blind process because the conditions to which the organism must adapt in order to survive are never the same. In periods of drought, when seeds are hard to find, finches that happen to have long, narrow beaks, good for foraging. Now, I would assert that drought is, in a sense, a chaos creature, if you will. And we're going to talk about that with respect to temple in the third video. In periods of drought, when seeds are hard to find, finches that happen to have long, narrow beaks, good for foraging, will be favored over finches with broad, powerful beaks. More of their offspring will survive and reproduce in periods of abundance. When seeds are large and their shells are hard, the broad-beaked finches will hold the adaptive advantages. Finchness is a variable, not a constant. What does this have to do with jackals and sea monsters? In the Hebrew language, their understanding, you might look at a jackal and a sea monster or a dragon and say, well, they're completely different creatures. One looks like a dog and the other is this mythological creature. But how do they function in the world? Jackal is to wilderness as sea monster is to great deep. And this is in the language, and it is in the text. And my great cloud of witnesses that is reading the Bible along with me, absorbing it even as a child, is picking up these things, and it's all sitting there in my mind until something comes along and bang, the pieces come together. The penny drops, as Tim Keller says. And suddenly I begin to understand the relationship of jackal and desert to sea monster and great deep, and the relationship of creation and the desert wanderings of Israel, and Sinai and tabernacle. And then eventually we're going to get to the book of Revelation, which is an amazing book, one of my favorite books of the Bible. And you might say, well, I'm not going to listen to you anymore because of that. Well, there's a good reason why the book of Revelation is amazing, and it's not for all the reasons all of the Christians that are running around saying, the world's about to end tomorrow. That's not any of the reasons. The reason is because the book of Revelation in so many ways symbolically ties the rest of the Bible together and brings it to a conclusion. It's an incredible book. So let's finish with our sea monsters. So then you do a little search through the Hebrew text because you want to search it in Hebrew, but I'll put the English right next to it, and you pick an English text. English translations are every translation is interpretation, and so you got to watch it. And this is the value of working in the original language if you're going to use the Bible. So God created the great sea monsters, Genesis 1:2. Now pay attention, Exodus 7:9. When Pharaoh says to you, this is the Lord talking to Moses, giving him his marching orders to go to Pharaoh, perform a wonder. Then you shall say to, when Pharaoh says to you, perform a wonder, because, hey, if Moses is going to have authority, he's going to have to show that he has divine authority from the gods and divine power, because Pharaoh is a god. Pharaoh is, and again, Peterson will grab onto this. Pharaoh is the instantiation of the divine. He's the top of the hierarchy, but in that world order, they locate it in a person. And so Pharaoh says basically, hey, don't come into here talking like this. You're going to have to show me that you can stand up to a god. The Lord knows this. So when Pharaoh says to you, perform a wonder, then you will say to Aaron, take your staff, throw it down before Pharaoh, and it will become a tanin. Now, in your English Bible, you read a snake, and you think, oh, it's a snake. That's a neat trick. But now you've got the association with a monster, with a chaos creature. In other words, when Moses and Aaron march into Pharaoh, and Pharaoh's like, show me what you got. Moses says, you see this stick? In my stick, there's chaos. What are you going to have to do with that? And Pharaoh's like, my guys can do chaos too. But then if you remember the story, the serpent from the staff of Moses and Aaron eats the serpents that Pharaoh's magicians make. Well, what does that mean? Well, we all know what it means. It's mythological. It's archetypal. It gets down into the, people who get a Wycliffe translations in a jungle in Central America or South America. When they read this story, they all know what it means. Well, what does that mean? So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and did as the Lord has commanded. And Aaron threw down his staff before Pharaoh and his officials, and it became a tanin, a sea monster. Now, Isaiah You'll find these sea monsters all over the Bible. Awake, awake, put to strength. O arm of the Lord, awake as in days of old, the generations long ago. Was it not you who cut Rahab to pieces? I'm going to have to get into that. And who pierced the dragon? This is in the book of Isaiah. This is in the Bible. So to my Christian brothers and sisters who love the Bible and have pledged that, this is your authority, this is in the Bible. What does Isaiah 51:9 mean? Well, it's a good question. Look it up. Jeremiah 51, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon has devoured me. He has crushed me. He has made an empty vessel. He has swallowed me like a monster. Nebuchadnezzar is a chaos creature. He's brought chaos upon Jerusalem, and he's devoured God's people. He has filled his belly with my delicacies. He has spewed me out. He not only ate me, he threw me up, and I'm lying discarded on the ground, not even worth digestion. Again, why do I love the Bible? Read it. It's an amazing book. The difficulty that we have is it's a foreign book. It's a strange book. And so I think part of what Jordan Peterson is doing for a lot of people is helping them see the Bible through new eyes, and lights are coming on. Ezekiel 29, I'm in the book of Ezekiel right now with my adult Sunday school class and loving it. Thus says the Lord, I am against you, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, the great dragon sprawling in the midst of its channels, saying, the Nile is mine own, I made it for myself. In other words, Pharaoh is a usurping sea monster. Now, if you get into the book of Daniel, you'll notice all of these monsters coming up out of the sea. Again, this is all the same story. And the Hebrews would get it, and the Babylonians would get it, and the Egyptians would get it, and the Aboriginal living in some rainforest somewhere where missionaries stumble and say, oh, here's a book in your trade language. They read it and they get it. Now, what's with that? Can we answer that question? If we can't answer that question, can we at least acknowledge the reality of the question? And this is my favorite, sea monsters at worship. In the Psalms. Now the Old Testament is Torah, the first 5 books, the prophets, which is just about everything else. And then at the end, in terms of how the Hebrews have the structure of the Old Testament, Christians put the writings in the middle. The Jews put the writings at the end, and they're called the writings, and that's Job, Psalms, Prophets, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. They're the writings, and they have a little different status. But these Psalms, you divided the sea by your might. What does it mean when God lets them walk through the dry land in the Red Sea? I can't wait till Jordan Peterson gets into Exodus. That's going to be great fun. You broke the heads of the dragons in the waters. Well, this is the Lord as victor over the great sea creatures. Now, again, we're going to have to get into this when we get into probably the next one when I have John Walton virtually talking to Jordan Peterson and reading some stuff out of John Walton and engaging some of what Peterson is doing. This is my favorite one, Psalm 140. Oh, you tread on the lion and the adder, the young lion and the serpent. Well, what does a lion and a serpent have in common? They're both dangers. If you're living in an area that has lions and serpents, these are chaos creatures because they can take your life or the life of a loved one like this. And this is my favorite one, Psalm 148. The Christian Reformed Church has a long history of psalm singing. In fact, that's one of the reasons the Christian Reformed Church split from the Reformed Church of America. And I remember there's a great hymn based on Psalm 148. And I remember the sea monsters in the hymn. And as a little boy, I used to love singing about the sea monsters. And again, there's something deep in us that ties to this. Why do little boys love sea monsters? Well, it's built into us. Well, praise the Lord from the earth, you sea monsters and all the deep. Here, the psalmist is calling to chaos to bow its knee and worship the Lord. Now, if you watch Tolkien, think about, for example, when Aragorn goes and demands the fealty of the former traitors who are now dead, and uses the army of the dead to finally, rescue Minas Tirith from the armies of Mordor. Well, in a sense, what's happening there in Tolkien, where the army of the dead has to pledge allegiance and pay homage to their king. Well, this is Psalm 148. The sea monsters finally bow. Well, look at C.S. Lewis and Narnia. I mean, this is all through Narnia, because, of course, C.S. Lewis loved this stuff and wrote about this stuff. And part of the complaint that Tolkien had of Lewis, they were friends, they had a falling out later in life, and that's a very tragic thing, and I think both grieved it deeply. But one of the things that Tolkien never liked about Lewis's Narnia was it was a hodgepodge, and Lewis just kind of threw the whole menagerie in, and in a sense, like Psalm 148, had all of them bow before Aslan. So, this is the book of Job has lots of this stuff. Job being a book, a non-Hebrew book. That's part of the thing with the wisdom literature. The scholars and the sages of Israel drew in the wisdom of the other cultures, and a lot of that is found in the writings. But this is built into the Bible, and part of the difficulty that we have is we have these filters, and we exclude it, or we can't see it, or we don't see it until the light comes on, and suddenly we realize, oh, Psalm 148 is calling all of the earth to bow before him. See, as the hymn says, sea monsters all. Now, my next video, I'm going to have John Walton virtually talks with Jordan B. Peterson and engage some of those things, because there's some stuff in the Biblical Series 2 lecture that I want to deal with. And then in the second of this 3-part series, I want to engage in the big, non-obvious, at least to moderns, element of Genesis 1 that Jordan B. Peterson completely missed, but which ties the chaos theme through the Bible and connects seemingly disparate elements like Israel, worship, and sacrifice. So there's a teaser, and I'll be getting that into the 3rd video. So again, thanks for watching. This has been great fun. I love the comments. I enjoy reading the comments. I hope I can keep up with them. At the beginning, I was worried about all these subscribers. I'm getting my head around it. So always room for one more. And if this is helping you, if you're enjoying it, leave a comment. Even if you just say, hey, this was great, keep doing it, that encourages me. If you can tell me how this helps you, that is even more helpful to me, because it helps me figure out what I should talk about to be helpful for you. So, thanks for watching.